Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, so our panel is Professor Nick Beach, Vice Chancellor of Middlesex University, talking from the point of view of education and community. And we'll start with Nick. I'll carry on introducing though. Dr. Husna Ahmed will be talking about environment. Welcome. Deacon Anthony Clark, who we've already met, will be reflecting on pastoral care and end of life. And last but not least, Councillor Jill Sargent, Chair of Community Leadership and Libraries Committee, will be talking about community. And so sticking with that order, I'm going to begin by inviting Nick to speak. And I'll keep an eye on the time, but it's roughly 5 minutes each if you need it. Thank you. Over to you, Nick.
Many thanks, and a real joy to be with you all today. Can I just check that you can hear me okay? Yeah.
Fine, yeah.
So I think one of the interesting things about the nature of change is that when you're in the midst of it, it feels rather different to either looking forwards to it or looking backwards at it. And so earlier we were talking about the pace of change and the experience of that as being ever increasing. And it's also fair to say, if you look at what previous generations have said, they would also say something quite similar. So I think it's worth us reflecting a little bit that although the pace is incredibly fast for us and is now multidimensional in a way that it probably was less so in previous generations, I think generations throughout history have had to deal with what for them was an incredibly fast pace of change. Secondly, that when we think about what's in the news, what we hear through various media, then actually most of the news tends to be negative. Most of it will tell us about conflict or war or opposition or economic downturn. And actually there's very little space in the mass media for good news, for development, and indeed sometimes for challenges that are met and either partially or fully overcome. And I think that has also been something that has been with us throughout history. And lastly, I think there's a slight danger within that context of splitting the world or splitting people into heroes and villains. And that when we do that, the great difficulty, I think, is that we end up putting people into boxes from which it's actually quite hard for them to escape, because they become labeled as if that is a permanent label. But if we accept that the world is changing in multi-dimensions and changing fast, it's also reasonable, I think, for us to accept that people themselves are changing, and we, throughout our life, ought to try to be developing and to develop others. So when I put those three things together, I can't help but be struck by the contrast between everything we've been discussing today and indeed in the other multi-faith meetings, and the sorts of things that we see in the media. And I just wanted to draw attention to a couple of them. And I think they do relate to education. And education often thought of as younger people, and that is true for the vast majority of our students. But actually, we in Middlesex, we have more mature students at most universities around the UK. So it isn't something, I think, that just stops at a point in life. Actually, people are always renewing. And so the things I just wanted to stress were, one, I think it is worth us focusing on how we can treat each other as complex and developing people, not as simple heroes and villains, not as stereotypes, but actually as a set of interconnected and moving parts. And I think what the forum has done brilliantly is to really draw attention to both our similarities and our differences. In my view, we have more similarities than differences, but the differences are largely interesting rather than oppositional. And I think that is the sort of thing that we should focus on. I think there's quite a contrast to, for example, UK politics around the replacement of the Prime Minister, in which you can see people largely objectifying each other and putting them into boxes. Secondly, I think there is a point about strength coming from inclusivity, not exclusivity. So when we see conflict and war and exclusion, actually, quite often this is about one group gaining advantage over another, status, social status, economic status. But again, I think what happens locally for us is much more about inclusion, and particularly inclusion that's driven by a will to learn from and with each other. So I think that's another really important way of reacting to change. And lastly, and this would never make its way onto any manifesto, but I'm actually rather in favor of moderation, and that sometimes when we end up at extreme positions, it makes it harder for us to hear and listen to the people who perhaps are different to us and come from a different place. And so I think I would like to propose and support the work of the forum that does include a fairly moderate, thoughtful approach to listening to others, rather than a rather brash approach to telling other people what they ought to think. So I hope that's not an unreasonable position from an educational community point of view.
Thank you very much, Nick. Lots in there to reflect on, and right on time as well, I should say. Pretty much my 5-minute alarm went off just as you were concluding. I didn't explain at the beginning, but obviously following each panel member's words, there will be an opportunity obviously for us to discuss them as a wider meeting and to ask questions and to give our own reflections on these points. But I'd like to move on now to Husna, if you'd like to give us your reflection, please.
Thank you so much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, Your Worshipful Council Mayor of Barnet, Councillor Alison Moore. Assalamu alaikum and peace be upon you all. I think the theme, responding to our changing world, is very apt, as whilst we are all very aware of the climate crisis, we tend to underestimate the magnitude of the task before us as individuals, communities and nations. The pandemic has also given us a chance to rethink all our assumptions and reimagine our world. Today, I'd like to focus my short intervention on the role of women and faith communities in developing a climate reset and the pathway to transformational solutions. Only one Earth was the slogan for the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, held in Stockholm in 1972. This put sustainable development on the global agenda and led to the establishment of World Environment Day. 50 years later, Sweden hosted Stockholm Plus 50 from the 2nd to the 3rd of June of this year, and then the World Environment Day on June the 5th. Whilst these international conferences are significant, we need to recognize that we cannot live in silos, and we must attempt to capture the intersectionality and diversity which has been missing in the past. Of course, we need the science and the political will, but without hearts and minds, without a strong moral compass, without addressing historical injustices and continuing inequity, we will not succeed. As you all know, 84% of the planet's population are adherents to a religion or faith, and with the majority of them based in the global south, it's imperative that policy considerations on global health, education, skills and jobs from a faith perspective are promoted. To cite Faith for the Climate, an interfaith climate organization, many of our faiths and belief systems are united by the golden rule: treat others as you wish to be treated. In a globalized world, this doesn't apply only to our near neighbors. It calls us to take responsibility for the global impact of our actions. We must begin to ask how wealthy societies can make reparation for the harm caused by centuries of imperialism, extraction, and exploitation. Faith communities have historically been significant innovators in supporting social justice, challenging inequity, and bringing about social change. Recognition of the role of faith communities and indigenous communities is only the beginning. Tackling climate change is a duty upon all of us because it has become a reality. Like the COVID pandemic, it's something which impacts the entire planet and all of humanity. But unlike COVID-19, climate change doesn't have a vaccine. As women, we are guardians of the earth. Our wombs bear the next generations. Our love, protection, empathy, and care is more profound than ever when we're facing a triple planetary crisis. The triple planetary crisis is climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste. These issues reinforce one another and endanger the future of our planet. I know that my sisters throughout the world have a vital role to play in the global stage. Their well-being is essential to the continued survival of humanity. Women invest around 90% of their income into their own households, including their children. This is 30 to 40% higher than men's investments in their own households. Women are also shown to be less risk averse and more willing to change their habits. We need to guarantee their safety and security so that they can flourish. So how do we shift the dial? What are the transformational solutions I'd like to see? Knowledge is a key solution. By educating our women and faith communities about climate change and the environment, we'll be able to see a positive change. The idea that a good education opens up the soul and brings one closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is central to Islam. Only those of his servants that are learned truly fear God, Quran 35:28. According to Imam al-Ghazali, knowledge exists potentially in the human soul, like the seed in the soil. By learning, the potential becomes actual. This illustrates the fundamentally transformative nature of education from an Islamic perspective. But as Muslim women, it's not easy at all. As a British Bangladeshi woman and a mother of 3 daughters and 2 granddaughters, I'm very cognizant of the barriers facing our Muslim young women today in every aspect of their lives. Islamophobia is what we face in the UK on a daily basis, and it's not exclusive to the UK. This is the lived reality of most Muslims. However, the barriers one faces in the global north are quite different from the global south. Awareness of faith and cultural sensitivities and accommodating them is rarely recognized as a positive intervention for empowering women. So access to opportunities and unlocking potential is, a solution. You're all familiar with the term leave no one behind. Leave no one behind is the central transformative promise of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. It represents the unequivocal commitment of all UN member states to eradicate poverty in all its forms, end discrimination and exclusion, and reduce the inequalities and vulnerabilities that leave people behind and undermine the potential of individuals and of humanity as a whole. The reality on the ground is so different from these commitments. 2015 was the year that the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals were launched. This was the same year that the BMFF signed a covenant with Barnet Council. This covenant means that we are the strategic voice of the faith sector. Why am I highlighting this covenant? Because it's clear that we need all sectors of society if we're going to respond to our changing world. The pandemic has provided clear evidence of the invaluable benefits of this partnership development and strategic engagement. Now more than ever, we need to build partnerships and trust to enable joint action to tackle the triple planetary crisis. We must be at the individual as well as the collective level, aware and conscious of our limited resources, which we share not only with billions of other people on this planet, but all creation, and driven to preserve and utilize them sustainably. Finally, we need to stop only using the Western lens to find solutions, as without diversity and inclusion, we will fail. Investment, investment, investment. We need to invest in infrastructure, health systems, education, green technology, and digital transition, social protection, economic inclusion, and decent jobs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Husna, for those words. Yeah, I mean, I'm making lots of notes, I'm sure you all are. But without further ado, I'm going to move us on to Deacon Anthony, if you'd like to give us your reflection, please.
Okay, my area that I'm talking about is the one that I've been working with for the last 3 years within Barnet Multi-Faith Forum, and it's to do with the pastoral and family preparing for the final days before death. This has become particularly acute, given that during the pandemic, the number of deaths occurred of individuals away from their families, very opposite of how death should occur in a family, in a community. And there are many families who have been traumatized by somebody, granny, dying in hospital, nobody with her, perhaps a nurse trying to hold a phone next to her head, no words coming out. But the heart of what we're looking at in a working group that I help with is trying to make it common that people will prepare, especially as they get a bit older, saying what they want in their final days. so often it's left to chance. People end up dying in hospital when they wanted to die at home. People are in care homes and rush to hospital again when they want to quietly stay in a home. And until recently, there's been no proper system for connecting up the information about this. There has been a small system called Coordinate My Care, CMC, partly funded by NHS, partly private, but it didn't quite join up everybody. Ambulance drivers, for example, couldn't see whether somebody had a do not resuscitate notice, so they were always bound to take somebody into hospital, perhaps precisely when it was not required. Why it's especially relevant today for us in our changing world is that Barnet, like most of the West, especially Western Europe, we're very much an aging society. There are much more older people than younger people now. And this whole area of helping the younger people help the older people prepare for their own deaths, prepare where they're going to happen, what the resources available. Again, it's common knowledge that the care homes are struggling to get staff, and home help is an area of a real dearth of people willing to do anything. So families are required much more to take on something that they've hardly been prepared for. And it needs, therefore, much more family discussion, ordinary discussion, public discussion about the end of life. Most hospitals have got a policy now of saying they make sure every patient who is likely to die within a year knows that that's likely to be the case. Can never be sure, obviously. But certainly the faith groups, and they're doing it already, are encouraging their members, their worshippers, to talk as a family and know what each other's wishes are. It's difficult to get the conversations going. There's a charity called Dying Matters, which holds each year a week where it gives hints and helps to try and get discussions going and a record kept of what people want. But it all boils down to this respectful care for us of something that's going to happen to all of us, and in a way that is appropriate, recognizing the resources available and recognizing the actual wishes both of the individual and the surrounding and supporting family. That's the element of my contribution, and I'll end there.
Thank you, Anthony. Really thought-provoking stuff, and yes, not a subject I think any of us spend anywhere near enough time talking about, particularly with families. And as you say, it's for ourselves and everyone. Finally, I'd like to move on to Councillor Sargent. If you'd like to give us your words, please, Joe.
Sorry, I was just unmuting. Well, can everybody hear me? Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here representing Councillor Sarah Conway, who's unable to be here today. She wanted to be here as the new chair of Communities and Libraries. And as she was unable to be here, she invited me to come as her deputy. I'd also like to thank the Mayor of Barnet for her excellent introduction and the other presenters today as well. I was interested to hear Nick Beach and would like to thank him for the outward-facing role that Middlesex University is playing in the community and really is practicing what it preaches in what he was saying. I very much respected what Anthony Clark had to say, as I used to work with Age UK and wrote a paper on dignity in dying some time ago. So I'm very cognizant with that. And Husna Ahmed, thank you very much for bringing us into focus with the importance of faith in what we're doing. But I was asked to talk about community groups and what their impact has and how they can reflect on this. I start from the basis that I actually went to the Multi-Faith Forum East Finchley Faith Walk, so saw the amazing work that was done in that, and I really look forward to that growing, because again I think that shows how community groups and faith groups can come together. And that brings me on to the work of Dr. Shah and what he's trying to do with the Jain community. I'm only sorry he didn't live to see his wonderful idea develop further. So I'm going to be talking about where we are and how far we've come in this field. Because Barnet has 402,000 residents, which is an enormous number. I mean, it's nearly it'll soon be 500,000, I wouldn't be surprised. But more importantly, there are 190 languages spoken. And it's extraordinary, just the numbers of groups that reflect this diversity of this very large borough. And how does this work? Well, I first started working in Tower Hamlets in the 1970s. I thought it sounded as if I was going to the 19th century. I meant the 1970s, sorry. It does feel quite a long time ago, but not quite the 19th century. And when I was working there, I worked with the first Asian detached youth worker. And what he said then, which nobody would say now, is that how nobody realized that coming from the East African community, he had a very different background from the Bangladeshi community who were arriving. And I think we have to realize, how far we have come. That was, within our lifetimes, there were people who had no concept of different communities and what they meant and what was involved and all the that wouldn't happen today. And furthermore, when I worked in Luton, establishing a law centre, I worked with a range of community groups, and it showed how you could work with a number of groups to develop long-term organisations. And I think this is the point I want to make with Barnet. It not only has a very wide range of local groups, but it's the way in which they work together, which is so interesting and shows how much thought and practice has been put into that. This afternoon, for example, and there are many examples, but this is just one because I was there this afternoon. This afternoon, I was at an event run at the Meritage Centre for looking at health and well-being. And there on the stalls, there was the New Citizens Gateway, who works with the refugee community. There was the Somali community also having a stall. There was Age UK, but there was also the London Fire Brigade showing how all these groups can work together. That is an extraordinary range of groups, and that's just one example. And it's not just lip service. They really were there. They were talking, they were working together. And, to talk on Nick Beach's thing about the positiveness, we have to build on this. This is what we're going to have to rely on. It's taken many, many years to get this far, and we have done. There are going to be huge challenges ahead, but we in Barnet have got a real basis to build on. And I think it's a very positive thing. And I think this is reflected in the new groups who are coming, who want to join. I was talking to the Hong Kong community, and they are very interested in working together. They don't want to be a separate group. I'm going to visit one of the refugee community hotels, and they also will want to be involved in this. And I think we must build on this, because I totally agree there are going to be huge challenges ahead. But if any borough is better placed to do it, it is Barnet. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sargent. And of course, you are the Vice Chair of Community Leadership and Libraries and the Chair of Children's Education and Safeguarding Committee. Apologies for getting your portfolios mixed up.
It's fine.
So everybody has now spoken, and I'd like to open the discussion up to the wider forum. But firstly, thanks to all four of our speakers for those reflections, and a lot in there to take away. I'm going to hand over and see if anybody else has any questions they'd like to ask or any comments they'd like to make on what we've heard. Sorry, that's my alarm. my 5-minute alarm. I would like to say personally for me, I think one thing that all the speakers that came across was, I think all of them touched on the importance of this forum in some way. And I think I'd like to think that this forum reflects concepts that were talked about in each of those presentations, which I think reaffirms the purpose and the importance of this group of people and how we work together. In particular, Nick's comments about people having more in common than what divides them, and that the things that do differentiate us are interesting, and something for us to learn and develop about. I also think a lot of the topics that Hosna talked about in terms of what's happening in the world and how we might collectively challenge them as well. As I mentioned before, Deacon Anthony's words about end of life are really pertinent to all of us, and certainly I think it's an interesting thing. I think the avoidance of the subject of death I've always taught as a cultural thing, but it seems to be something that a lot of cultures share. And perhaps people of faith are sometimes more at home talking about end of life because it's an important rite of passage in many religions into a next life, but it doesn't seem to make it any less painful or difficult sometimes to have that conversation. Except if you're my mother, who seems to mention her death despite being in perfect health whenever I meet her, and tells me what I'm going to inherit and where everything's kept. And obviously, Councillor Sargent, we talked before about some of the community groups, both the organisations that support our communities in Barnet and also those communities themselves, and particularly the displaced people that Barnet welcomes and hosts at the moment. And it's really great that you'll be visiting one of the asylum hotels as well. I think that'll be a fascinating experience, and I'm keen to do the same myself. I can see Councillor Moore, you have your hand up.
Yes, it was a reflection and actually picks up a little bit from what you were saying, Will. I have reason to be listening. I think you're right that there are, in the modern world, many people, particularly in the context of modern medicine being able to continue to challenge and use medical interventions quite late on. And can people hear me, or have I disappeared? Oh, okay. Somebody else had frozen on my screen, so I wanted to make sure it wasn't me. That we've in a sense, for some of us, we've got out of touch with that last phase of life. And what prompted that thinking for me is my father died some 7 years ago, and I happened to be travelling down to Southampton to see him in hospital in what became his last couple of weeks of life, though we didn't know that at the time. And I caught an episode of the BBC programme, Radio 4 programme, 1-to-1. And it was David Snyder talking to Catherine Mannix, who was a palliative care consultant. And she was talking about that need to re-engage with that last year or 18 months of life. And that there is a knack from her perspective as a palliative care consultant, embracing the fact that there is that period in towards the end of your life when your world becomes smaller, where there are a range of changes. If you haven't heard it, it's still actually there as a podcast on the BBC site. It was a really interesting program as I drove down, and I think helped me in terms of that relationship with my father over those last few weeks. And one of the things that may or may not be relevant, I mean, I think you're right that many faith communities, because they have a framework to think about those issues and discuss them, may be more resilient in terms of perhaps discussing, or certainly having a framework to face those issues. And maybe it's something that we as a healthy society need to do more, to recognise that medical intervention towards the end of life isn't always the right thing to do, and actually being able to have those discussions more easily with friends and family or as a society, and that actually what we're thinking about is a good death, what that means, what the end of a natural end of life means. I mean, clearly that's different from somebody who's in a medical crisis when they're younger, but actually as people are reaching the end of their life, that dignity and that period of coming to the end of your life is part of a natural it's a natural stage in our life. And I just thought it was what the discussion was quite an interesting one, and it just put me in mind of that programme, and that maybe we've lost some of that being in touch with that final phase of our life in a modern society, because we continue to challenge that using modern medicine. So I just thought I'd pop that into the discussion, because I think it's an interesting element to discuss in the context of that. Your last comments, Will.
Thank you, Alison. And Karishma, you have your hand up. Would you like to come?
Thank you very much, William. And immense gratitude to each of our speakers today, because what you have done is not just given us thoughtful reflections yourself, but set us thinking. I'd like to put to each of you, if I may, if William permits, how you feel we at the BMFF could bridge the existence between the senior generations and the more junior generations, so that we can leverage the power of togetherness, which each of you have highlighted in your own talks today. Will that be okay, William? Are we allowed to request further thought?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you very much, because I have learned so much through the mentoring that David has given me and Esmond has given me with their patients over the last year, and the family spirit of the BMFF. Because I lost my father just before COVID struck, and I joined the BMFF a few months later. And I've been isolating with my elderly mother for 2 years and 3 months, completely isolated. So BMFF has become my extended and very, very loving family. So if we could have your thoughts on how we can extend this to the youth.
Yes, Jill.
Thank you very much, and that was very moving. I lost my father just before the pandemic, and I had just fantastic care. And I do take on board that point about that Councillor Moore was making about medical intervention. And luckily, because I had done so much work on Dignity in Dying with Age UK, I knew exactly what the beliefs were. And I think the trouble is many people have not had that discussion or thought about it. And that was extremely helpful. But moving forward, I must say I was terribly impressed with the interface walk. It's something I would really like to see expanded, and I could really see young people having a role in that, linking it in. I mean, I remember our synagogue organised a walk to an old people's home, and I remember taking these very small children to these old people's home, and I was emphasising how very, very old these people were. They were very, very old, I said. You know, they are very old people. And one of them said, "Are they dead?" So, I mean, you know, and it was wonderful because the first walk we did was really, you know, people wondered why we were going. The second year we went, you know, and by the time our group really didn't have time to do it, they were really upset we were no longer coming. So I do think these things do take time to build up, but I can really see something like that being a great thing to involve younger people. And I really enjoyed it, and I got the most beautiful bunch of flowers, which are still alive.
Thank you for that, Councillor Sargent. Anthony.
Yes, I've got a straightforward and rather simple suggestion, but it's beginning to take off in some places, and that is to ask if you've got a situation of grandparent, parent, child, the parent asks the child to interview the grandparent to write down their life for their family. It's a very specific thing to do. It's to ask them, you know, when were you born? What was it like growing up? can be done by tape recording, it's using your phone, or can be done by interview. But where you have the younger generation interviewing the older generation and writing it down as a family record, it gets them involved in what end of life and what life, the meaning of life is all about. Because suddenly the younger generation asking the older generation, well, why did you do that? What did it mean? What was it like when you emigrated or whatever? And I think the various websites that offer very expensive, we'll help you write biographies, but you can just do it yourself. And I think if a parent encourages a child to interview Granny and write it down. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. Nick.
Thanks. Well, I think it was a lovely question, really, about how we get more intergenerational contact. And I know that your situation is one of great closeness, which is lovely. I think really I have two thoughts. One is asking for help can sometimes be a really powerful thing to do. And in the question, you talked a little bit about mentoring and support. And quite often we think about mentoring and support coming from an older generation to a younger generation. But there are times when it can go the other way really productively. So when the university had to go online, some of the academic staff were really, very hot on IT and able to move over really quickly. Others were not. They were very skilled in and knowledgeable about a particular thing, but probably not IT experts. And what we ended up doing was having student digital buddies for academics. So there would be an academic who was, of an older generation being supported by a current student who was more digitally able than them. And because they were then interacting in that sort of way, it really forms some fantastic bonds. In the work that I do with the Students' Union, I've had a series of what are called reverse mentors, and I've become quite uncomfortable with the idea of reverse mentor, i.e. somebody more junior mentoring somebody more senior, partly because the learning is just fabulous. So I just call them mentors now. And particularly I've had mentors who come from different faiths, different genders, different backgrounds. And the learning from that has just been quite wonderful. And I found people really willing to support on that. And my last point is actually a reflection on things like the walks that we've talked about. Quite often just doing something together. And it almost doesn't matter what it is, but there's an activity, something that you're doing enables those conversations to happen. And I'm sure that many of the students would be really interested in those sorts of conversations. And if people in the group are interested in them, I'm sure that we could probably set up a conversation to say, well, what something might some of the students do to connect into the broader community more effectively than they do at the moment.
Great, thank you, Nick. And the last of our speakers to address that question, Husna.
Yeah, so I think it's very pertinent what the question, because I noticed when Ben was doing the accounts that we didn't have any funds for youth development. I think it's critical that we've got Barnet Council here, so we really do need to put some applications in for youth, supporting youth to get involved in different activities. I think the Faith and Peace Walk is a beginning, but I think we need to do a lot more. Actually, maybe have focus groups with the youth to find out what interests them, so that we can really engage with them and get them involved. So it's not just one-off, and we build up a pool of youth volunteers and activists who will be the future BMFF, basically. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I've got hands up. I think Ez was first and then Ben.
Right. Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. Am I unmuted? Yeah, okay, fine, thank you. First of all, to say that we've got actually 2 applications in for youth facilities, a youth coordinator at present, and awaiting on that. I have to say that apart from Anthony's lovely interventions and the concept of the Peace Walk that have been mentioned, which are all great things. What we need is professional development for both youth services and, of course, for community group development as well. All this infrastructure, let's remind ourselves, has actually been taken away in the last 12 years. So it's important that the new administration looks very closely at the actual development and redevelopment of the skill that he's working with young people, forming relationships, talking about society, looking at them across the piece. So therefore they are involved and active, because young people, as we know, are very active in many things in the community. But it needs and it requires, like many other things, professional support and services. We know, we can see that volunteering has done great stuff, but it isn't able to be consistent and developmental. So I make the plea, which I make the plea that this is something that should go on in the communities. We also, to following up Anthony's point, nurseries actually do encourage vice versa, meeting with elderly homes, etc. So there's a lot of really good stuff going on. And as Nick actually mentioned, these are really good pieces of work which don't often make the news because they're not newsworthy. So there are lots of stuff, we need to put it together, but I do make the plea that the youth service and community services of support are really supported and developed by Barnet Council in connection with, of course, the voluntary sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Hez. Sorry, it's been brought to my attention, David, I didn't notice your hand was up because it's merging into the BMFF logo, so I'm not sure whether you or Ben were first, but I don't mind who wants to go in.
Yeah, actually, I noticed mine was sort of blending away a bit. No, it was two things really that kind of tied together. One is that I think over the last 2 or 3 years, there has been an absolutely seismic shift in talking about stuff. Things that were taboos, things that were not talked about are being talked about openly in various meetings that I'm involved in various community groups that I'm involved in. So for instance, the largest killer of men under the age of 45 is suicide. Now, men in meetings, even in business networking meetings, are talking openly about mental health. Really quite an amazing shift. And I think this sort of openness and conversation and discussion is really quite enlightening. And when you think about all of the different types of topics that have been talked about, kind of talking and getting things out there is really kind of a skill that is actually coming out and becoming more socially acceptable. I've had 2 conversations in the last 2 days about the menopause, something which, you know, to go back 2 years would have never happened as a man, you know, but actually having it as a normalized, regular conversation. And these sorts of things, I think, are quite transformative in the way in which we live together as people. And then the second thing, which was also kind of conversational, which I wanted to touch in on what Anthony had said, was my experience. So my father died 20 years ago. And my experience for both myself and with others is that a lot of people want to know about their history and about their family past and kind of what their grandfather did and what their father did. And those questions arise after death, when it's too late to find out the answer. And so wouldn't it be great to be able to have those conversations early on? Because actually it's the fascinating stuff. It's the stuff that makes us who we are and kind of is the backstory. And so again, it's another piece where conversations, open conversations brought forward, I think can add so much and enrich our lives and just enrich ourselves in terms of understanding who we are, where we've come from, and kind of where we're going. So yeah, that was it. So yeah, thank you.
Right, thank you, David. And Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Will. Yes, David mentioned a word which is kind of the key word for the bit that I wanted to just throw into the conversation, and that's openness. I think we recognized from the very eloquent, well-informed reflections that were shared about how a lot of the things we had known about and the things that we have become aware that we're familiar with, by the changing nature, by the way things drifted and everything changed all of a sudden, we came to the shocking realization that most of the things we have known and had felt comfortable with and have felt to be normal in the way we do our things, all of a sudden could not stand. And therefore, there had to be, if I take it from the last 2-3 years from pandemic coming down, there had to be a relearning of so many things. And I think in this changing world, that openness and the desire, conscious effort for learning continuously at every context would be key to get us going. And so and I borrow a phrase from Proper about kind of we intently planting ourselves in the way of learning, opportunities to engage. It has to start from there. Ourselves and young people, if the elderly and the young are going to be able to connect and do things together, we have to plant ourselves in the way. We have to create opportunities for us to engage. Let the work sometimes have young people feed into it as well. And let's see what we can get from it. And when we have that opportunity for these engagements at all these levels, education, family, communities, pastoral care, all that, we should come with an openness to learn, to engage with, to possibly play down a little bit, maybe for just a little while, all the things we have known, have experienced, that we are comfortable with, and be prepared to allow ourselves into uncomfortable zones of a little discomfort, but with the openness to learn and to engage and to enable each other. I think that will be very, very important if we're going to be able to move forward in this very rapidly, fluidly changing landscape of our world now.
Thank you, Ben. And yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I think it's never seemed more important to be open and understanding and tolerant than it seems to be at the moment, with so much pressure to not be, as Nick was saying earlier, about how very easy it is to other people and to classify them, whereas really we should be trying to understand each other. Karishma.
I'd just like to thank all our speakers and all those who have spoken today for giving us their reflections on this, because I'm truly very deeply grateful to the seniors here for their kindness and care and including a very inexperienced person, as also to Mr. Malcolm Debu of the Zoroastrian Trust Funds of Europe, who introduced me so kindly to Esmond, who welcomed me. So I think most people in society always think that juniors reach out and seniors then need to do something about it. But in reality, very often I've seen it's the seniors who often reach out to us with an openness to include people who are inexperienced, with that kindness that is truly most appreciated. And I know Mona tries to do this with her students at the university. And so thank you, Mona, and thank you, Vice Chancellor. Thank you.
Thanks, Karishma, and thanks everybody. I don't know if anyone has any further thoughts or reflections. Otherwise, I will hand the meeting back to our chair, David. And thanks again to everyone.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you. So thank you, Will. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Anthony, and also thank you, Husna. So really interesting. And I tell you what comes to mind with this is, it's a pity we don't do this sort of thing more often. It's really informative and interesting to kind of learn new perspectives, to kind of expand and sort of have your eyes opened into something that actually affects everyday life, but you don't normally notice it. And